The silence on the 25th floor of the Manhattan Business Tower at 3 in the morning was a specific, layered thing. It wasn't the empty silence of a tomb, but the charged stillness of a place where immense power lay dormant. It was a silence composed of the faint hum of enterprise-grade servers in a distant room, the whisper of conditioned air through brass vents, and the almost imperceptible groan of a glass and steel monolith settling into the bedrock of the city. James Washington, night janitor, Señor Custodian, invisible man, knew these sounds better than he knew the lines on his own hands. For 15 years they had been the symphony of his solitude. He moved through the hallowed halls, a ghost in a grey uniform, his presence marked only by the squeak of his cart's wheels and the gleaming surfaces he left in his wake. The executive floor was his last stop, a sanctuary of Italian leather, polished mahogany, an abstract art that cost more than the house in Queens he'd long since sold. Tonight, the rhythm was broken. A chime, delicate but sharp in the profound quiet, echoed down the corridor. It was the sound of the executive elevator, a car of brushed steel and smoked glass that was programmed to bypass this floor entirely after midnight. Its arrival was an anomaly, an error in the building's rigid, digital code. James paused, his hand still holding a microfiber cloth over the glass door of the main boardroom. He was a man of routine, a creature of the predictable night. Anomalies made him uneasy. He watched the elevator's floor indicator light up 25. The doors slid open with a sigh, revealing not a security guard on a late-night patrol, but a figure he recognized instantly, a woman whose face was the very emblem of the power that slept within these walls. Victoria Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, titan of finance, a name spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear in the pages of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. She was always perfectly composed. A portrait of icy command, whether in a television interview or the rare hallway encounter where her gaze would slice right through him, seeing not a man but a function, a part of the building's machinery. But the woman who stumbled out of the elevator now was a terrifying departure from that image. Her tailored blazer was askew, her breathing ragged. She clutched a phone to her ear, her movements jerky and uncoordinated as she staggered toward the boardroom. James instinctively shrank back, melting into the shadows as he was trained to do, as he had done for a decade and a half. His job was to be unseen, to erase the day's messes without leaving a trace of his own existence. He watched through the tinted boardroom glass as she collapsed against the mahogany table, the one fabled to have been carved from a single set tree. The phone slipped from her grasp, clattering onto the polished surface. Her face, usually a mask of stoic control, was twisted into a grotesque grimace of pain and confusion. Her left arm hung at her side, limp and useless. A dead weight she seemed to have forgotten was attached to her. She tried to speak, perhaps to the person still on the other end of the line, but the sounds that emerged were a thick, slurred torrent of nonsense syllables. It was a language of pure neurological distress. Panic began to bloom in her eyes, wide and terrified as she realized the profound betrayal of her own body. She was a woman who commanded legions, who moved global markets with a single word, and now she could not form a coherent one. For James, watching from the periphery, the world narrowed to that boardroom. The hum of the servers faded, the whisper of the vents went silent. In his mind he was no longer in a skyscraper in Manhattan. He was back in his small kitchen in Queens, sitting across from Dorothy as she patiently, passionately, turned their dinner table into a classroom. "Look at this, Jamie," she'd say, pointing to a diagram in one of her heavy neurology textbooks, the smell of garlic bread and marinara sauce mingling with the crisp scent of paper. FAST, face, arms, speech, time. It's simple, but it's the difference between life and a life half-lived. Face drooping on one side. Ask them to smile. One arm drifting down when they try to raise both. That's a big one. Speech slurred like they're drunk when they haven't had a drop. And time. Time is brain, baby. Every second that passes, more brain cells are dying. You don't wait. You don't ask questions. You act. Dorothy, his Dorothy, a 20-year veteran of the neurology ward at Chicago General, a healer who wore her scrubs like a suit of armor and her compassion like a crown. She had been the vibrant, beating heart of his world, until a drunk driver had turned their shared future into a solitary past 5 years ago. In the abyss of his grief, her lessons were all he had left of her practical, life-saving wisdom that, she had insisted, was as crucial as knowing how to read or write. "Doesn't matter if you're a janitor or a judge, Jamie," she'd insisted, her eyes sparkling with conviction. "A stroke doesn't check your bank account before it hits. Ignorance is the only real disability." He looked at Victoria Sterling, a woman who lived in a universe of wealth and influence so far removed from his own, it might as well have been another planet. Their worlds were not meant to intersect. He was the man who cleaned her toilet. She was the woman who owned the building it was in. To intervene was to shatter a sacred unspoken caste system. It was to make himself visible. And in this world, visibility for a man like him often came with consequences. He hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. In that sliver of time, he saw not the billionaire CEO, but a human being in terrifying trouble. He saw the flicker of panic in her eyes. The same panic he'd seen in the eyes of a neighbor who'd collapsed at a block party years ago. A man Dorothy had saved because she knew the signs. And in that moment, the voice in his head wasn't his own. It was Dorothy's.com and clear-cutting through his fear. Time is brain, baby. Act. The boardroom door hissed open under his hand. The sound made Victoria flinch, her head snapping. Towards him, her eyes, clouded with fear, struggled to focus on his form. He saw the flicker of confusion. The janitor, Ms. Sterling, James said, his voice imbued with a calm authority he hadn't used in 5 years. It was the voice he'd learned from Dorothy, the one she used to soothe families teetering on the edge of hysteria. You're having a stroke. Don't try to talk, just listen to me. I'm going to help you. A garbled protest escaped her, lips her functional right hand gesturing dismissively. But her attempt at command was lost in the neurological static. He ignored it, his focus absolute. He was already moving, pulling out his own worn cell phone and dialing 911 with practiced efficiency. As he spoke to the operator, he gently guided Victoria, easing her into a semi-reclined position on the floor, using a leather-bound financial report as a pillow to support her head. His movements were sure, his touch gentle but firm, preventing her from slumping in a way that could restrict blood flow or cause further injury. 911. What's your emergency? Ambulance needed at Manhattan Business Tower, 1100 Park Avenue, James said, his voice even and precise. 25th floor, executive boardroom. We have a female patient, mid-40s, conscious, presenting with classic signs of an stroke, onset of symptoms approximately 5 minutes ago. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Sir, can you describe the symptoms? Affirmative, James continued, his gaze fixed on Victoria. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting between him and the ceiling. Unilateral facial droop on the left side, pronounced weakness and paralysis in the left arm, or hemiparesis, severely slurred speech, indicative of dysarthria. Patient appears disoriented but is responsive. The 911 operator, accustomed to panicked, incoherent calls, was audibly taken aback. Sir, are you a medical professional? No, ma'am, James said, his focus unwavering. He was now checking Victoria's pulse, his fingers finding the carotid artery just as Dorothy had shown him. Strong but rapid. My wife was a neurology nurse. She taught me what to look for. Ambulance is en route. Yes, sir, they're on their way. The best crew in the district. Can you stay on the line with me? I will. Tell them to be prepared for a potential thrombectomy candidate. The window of opportunity is closing. He disconnected from the operator and turned his full attention back to Victoria. He spoke to her in a low, soothing murmur, explaining what was happening, what the paramedics would do, that she was in the safest possible place. He didn't know if she could understand his words, but he knew the tone of a calm voice could be an anchor in a storm of fear. He was no longer James Washington, janitor. He was Dorothy's husband, her best student, putting her legacy into action. When the paramedics burst through the door minutes later, their gear clanking in the silent opulence of the room, they found a scene that defied their expectations. The patient was stabilized, her airway clear, and kneeling beside her was a janitor in a gray uniform calmly providing a detailed, medically accurate account of the incident's progression, using terminology that made one of the younger paramedics glance at his partner in disbelief. This guy knows more about neurology than half the interns at Mount Sinai, the partner whispered as they loaded Victoria onto the gurney. James simply nodded, stepping back and melting into the background as they worked. He watched them wheel her out, a flurry of professional activity and medical jargon. He saw the lingering look of dazed gratitude in Victoria's eyes just before the elevator doors closed, a silent acknowledgement that their two disparate worlds had just collided in the most profound way imaginable, and then they were gone. The silence, now broken and altered, descended once more. The only evidence of the recent drama was his cleaning cart, standing sentinel by the door, and the faint, antiseptic smell of emergency medicine that now hung in the air. James took a deep breath. His heart was still pounding, a frantic drum, against his ribs. He looked at the mahogany table, at the overturned chair, at the faint scuff marks from the paramedic's boots. He was just the night janitor, the invisible man. His job was to erase the evidence, to reset the stage for the powerful people who would arrive in the morning, none the wiser. He picked up a stray piece of medical wrapping from the floor and placed it in his trash receptacle. He righted the chair. He wiped down the table, erasing the smudges and fingerprints. He returned to his duties, cleaning the offices, buffing the floors, emptying the wastebaskets. He worked with the methodical, practiced efficiency of a man who had performed the same tasks tens of thousands of times. But as he worked, a new unsettling thought began to crystallize in his mind. He was a man who noticed things. It was the nature of his job. He noticed the scuff mark on a CEO's shoe, the brand of whiskey favored by a junior executive, the faint tremor in the hand of a senior partner signing a late-night memo. Had noticed things about Victoria Sterling in the weeks leading up to this night. He'd found discarded bottles of high-end migraine medication in her trash. He'd seen her rubbing her temples in the elevator, her face etched with a pain she tried to hide. He had dismissed them as the standard battle scars of corporate warfare, stress, pressure, the cost of running an empire now. He wasn't so sure. Dorothy's voice echoed in his memory, a different lesson this time. One spoken with a grim seriousness as they discussed a particularly troubling case. Jamie, when you see a sudden, catastrophic neurological event in a healthy, relatively young person, the first question you ask isn't why. The first question is cui bono, who benefits. James pushed his cart down the empty hall, the squeak of the wheels sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet that followed the storm. He had saved Victoria Sterling's life. He was sure of it. What he didn't know was that in doing so, he had just made himself visible to forces that preferred to operate in the shadows. And what Victoria Sterling would soon discover about trust, medicine, and the true nature of the people around her would shatter the foundations of the world she had so carefully built. The stroke was not the end of her crisis. It was merely the opening act of a conspiracy so insidious it threatened not only her life, but the very empire she represented. The next morning the sun rose over Manhattan, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. But for James, it was the end of his day. He clocked out at 6 a.m., the city's frenetic energy just beginning to stir as he made his way to the subway. He expected life to snap back to its familiar, monotonous rhythm. He was wrong. When he arrived at the employee locker room in the sub-basement of the tower, he found it waiting for him. A crisp, white envelope was taped to the metal door of his locker. It wasn't a thank you note. It was a formal disciplinary warning, printed on official Sterling Industries letterhead. His eyes scanned the cold, bureaucratic text. Employee warning notice. Name, James Washington. Infraction, S1. Inappropriate and unauthorized use of the executive elevator during non-operational hours. 2. Unauthorized access to, and presence in restricted corporate facilities, executive boardroom after hours. 3. Deviation from assigned custodial duties and schedule. The signature at the bottom belonged to Wilson Carter, the head of security. Carter was a man carved from granite and cheap cologne, a former cop who carried himself with the self-important swagger of someone who measured his own worth by the petty miseries he could inflict on those beneath him. James had seen him berate cafeteria workers for smudges on the silverware and threaten firemen for parking their truck in a reserved spot during a false alarm. Power, for Carter, was not a responsibility. It was a bludgeon. James carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket. A cold knot formed in his stomach. 15 years of unblemished service, of perfect attendance, of quiet, dependable work. He had never received so much as a verbal reprimand. Now, less than 12 hours after saving the CEO's life, he was being formally disciplined. The bitter irony tasted like rust in his mouth. In the rigidly stratified world of the Manhattan business tower, it seemed that doing the right thing was a violation of protocol if you were the wrong kind of person doing it. But it wasn't the warning itself that truly unsettled him. It was the timing, the speed. The paramedics and hospital staff were bound by HIPAA. They wouldn't report the details of a medical emergency to a patient's corporate security. The 911 call was confidential. Victoria Sterling was likely still in an ICU, unable to communicate. So how did Wilson Carter know the specific details, the elevator, the boardroom so quickly? It suggested a level of surveillance that was unnervingly personal. Someone wasn't just watching the building, someone was watching Victoria Sterling. At evening, when James arrived for his shift, the building felt different. The air was thick with unspoken tension. He began his usual route, his senses on high alert. When he reached the 25th floor, he saw it. Through the glass doors of the executive wing, a heated discussion was taking place. Wilson Carter stood with his arms crossed, his posture radiating aggressive authority. Opposite him was a man James recognized from photographs in the company newsletter, Dr. Alistair Patterson, Victoria's renowned personal physician, a man with a clientele of billionaires and a reputation for medical discretion. Dr. Patterson, usually the picture of Obane.com, looked frantic. His face was pale, his hands gesturing wildly. James, feigning the need to polish a brass plaque on the wall, angled his cart to get a better view and catch snippets of their conversation. The sound was muffled, but the emotional tenor was clear. Patterson's voice was high-pitched, laced with panic. Carter's was a low, menacing growl. James couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He saw the dynamic. This wasn't a doctor consulting with security about a patient's welfare. This looked like an accomplice being berated by his superior. Dorothy's voice returned, a whisper of clinical wisdom from the past. Watch the people around the patient, Jamie. Their reactions tell you more than any chart. Competent doctors don't panic when a patient survives a close call. They're relieved. They celebrate the win. Panic means the outcome wasn't the one they were expecting, or the one they wanted. The seed of doubt planted in the pre-dawn hours began to sprout, its roots twisting around the cold reality of the warning notice in his pocket, and the strange tableau playing out before him. He had assumed Victoria's stroke was a tragic but natural event, a consequence of her high-stress life. Now, watching the panicked doctor and the predatory security chief, a more sinister hypothesis began to form. What if it wasn't natural at all? 2 days later, James received a summons, not from HR or Wilson Carter, but from the office of the CEO herself. The call came from Victoria's executive assistant, her voice crisp and formal, requesting his presence on the 25th floor at 4 o'clock. He spent the next hour in a state of quiet anxiety, changing into the cleaner of his despair, uniforms. As he rode the regular service elevator up, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was crossing a boundary, entering the heart of the world he was paid to keep pristine but never to participate in. He found Victoria Sterling sitting behind her enormous desk, a sleek expanse of glass and steel overlooking the sprawling city below. She looked pale and weary, the left side of her mouth still carrying a faint, almost imperceptible droop, but the commanding fire in her eyes was already returning. She was a warrior, temporarily wounded but far from defeated. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice a little softer, a little less sharp than he remembered. "Please, sit down." He took the offered chair, a piece of modern art that was surprisingly comfortable. He felt impossibly large and out of place in the minimalist, brutally elegant office. "I'm told that James is what you prefer," she began, her gaze intense and analytical. "Yes, ma'am. James, then, it seems a formal thank you is laughably inadequate for what you did. The doctors at the hospital were explicit. They said your immediate and correct identification of the stroke, and the precise information you gave to the paramedics, didn't just save my life, it saved my mind, it saved me. They said the call handler logged you as a civilian, but the paramedics thought they were talking to a neurologist." James felt a blush creep up his neck. "I only did what anyone ought to do, Ms. Sterling. Few people ought to know the clinical signs of an ischemic event or the term hemiparesis," she countered, a hint of a wry smile touching her lips. "The paramedics were quite taken with you. They mentioned you learned it from your wife." He hesitated. Talking about Dorothy was like touching a raw nerve, but something in Victoria's inquisitive, intelligent eyes told him this wasn't just idle curiosity. She was searching for something. "My wife, Dorothy, was a nurse," he said, his voice quiet. "She specialized in neurology for 20 years at Chicago General. She was a teacher at heart, believed everyone should know the basics. She passed away 5 years ago." Victoria's expression softened with a flicker of genuine empathy. "I'm very sorry for your loss. Her knowledge, through you, gave me a future. There's no way I can ever repay that." She paused, leaning forward slightly, her perfectly manicured hands clasping on the desk. "James, I need to ask you something. It's an unusual question, and it's entirely off the record." He simply nodded, waiting. "In your informal medical opinion," she said, choosing her words with surgical care, "based on what you saw that night, did my symptoms strike you as entirely natural?" The question hung in the air between them, electric. It was the very question that had been haunting him for the past 48 hours. A CEO worth billions, with a world-class physician on retainer, was asking her janitor for a second opinion on her own attempted murder, because that's what it was starting to feel like. More than that, her phrasing suggested she already suspected the answer. "Miss Sterling, with all due respect, that's a conversation you need to have with Dr. Patterson," he said carefully, testing the waters. Her response was a flash of raw frustration, a crack in the corporate armor. "I have," she snapped, then reined herself in. "Dr. Patterson has been my physician for a decade. He attributes it to executive stress. Overwork. He's prescribed sedatives and recommended a 6-week vacation to a spa in Switzerland." Chill, cold and sharp, traced its way down James's spine. Dorothy's voice again, lecturing him over a medical journal. "Prescribing sedatives after a TIA or a stroke is malpractice, Jamie. You don't sedate a brain that's been deprived of oxygen. You investigate the cause. You hunt for the clot, the bleed, the arrhythmia. You scan, you test, you question. Treating it like a case of the vapors is not just lazy, it's criminally negligent." He met Victoria's searching gaze. "He made a choice, Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Before that night, were there other symptoms, things that might have been warning signs?" Victoria froze, her eyes widening slightly. How could you know? That a stroke of that magnitude in a healthy woman your age rarely comes out of the blue," he explained, channeling Dorothy's clinical logic. "There are often precursors, transient ischemic attacks, mini-strokes, symptoms that are missed or explained away." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of city traffic far below. Victoria seemed to be re-examining months, maybe years, of her life through a new, terrifying lens. Finally, she gave a slow, hesitant nod. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "For the last year, maybe more, persistent headaches, bouts of dizziness I blamed on not eating, moments of mental fog, confusion. I couldn't grasp a name or a number that I knew perfectly well." "And what did Dr. Patterson say about these episodes?" James asked. Though he already knew the answer, he said it was the pressure of the job, she confirmed, her voice now laced with a dawning horror. "He told me I needed to delegate more, to meditate. He ran a basic blood panel, said I was healthy as a horse, just overworked." James kept his expression impassive, but inside, Dorothy wasn't whispering anymore. She was screaming. Every single one of those symptoms was a classic warning sign. Any competent neurologist would have ordered an MRA, a CT scan, an array of tests to rule out vascular abnormalities or other underlying conditions. To dismiss them as stress was so grossly incompetent it defied belief. It wasn't incompetence, it was intentional, a pattern of deliberate medical neglect designed to allow a condition to fester until it became catastrophic. As James stood to leave 15 minutes later, the unspoken understanding between him and the CEO was as solid and clear as the glass wall of her office. He had confirmed her deepest fears, and she had confirmed his. When he stepped out into the hallway, he saw Wilson Carter standing by the elevators, ostensibly examining a fire extinguisher. He wasn't fooling anyone. He was observing the meeting, a silent sentinel of intimidation. Carter looked up and met James's gaze. He didn't speak, he simply smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a threat as clear as a knife to the throat. "I see you. Stay out of what doesn't concern you." That night, as James pushed his cart through the darkened, empty offices, the pieces of the puzzle began to lock into place. The warning in his locker wasn't just petty vindictiveness. It was a message. To silence him, to put him back in his invisible box. The panicked meeting between Carter and Patterson wasn't a consultation. It was a conspiracy unraveling. Victoria's stress wasn't the cause of her illness. It was the cover story. For 15 years, James Washington had been the man no one saw. He was a ghost who polished the thrones of kings and queens of industry. But as he began to realize the depth of the rot within the walls of Sterling Industries, he understood that his invisibility was no longer a sign of his station. It was his greatest weapon. Carter and Patterson saw a simple-minded janitor, a man who got lucky. They couldn't possibly conceive of what he knew, what he was capable of understanding. They had underestimated him. And in the world of predators and prey, underestimation was a fatal mistake. James clipped his security badge back onto his uniform. The hunt was on. The following weeks were a masterclass in the art of being invisible. James moved through the building like a phantom, his senses sharpened to a razor's edge. His 15 years of silent observation had been his training ground. Now it was his battlefield. He learned the rhythms of the 25th floor not as a cleaner, but as an intelligence operative. He knew that Wilson Carter met with Dr. Patterson every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, always in Carter's office, a windowless room in the core of the building that was a fortress of paranoia. He knew that Dr. Patterson always carried a brown leather medical briefcase, and that briefcase never left the office with him when he departed. It stayed, locked in a small safe behind a framed print of a roaring lion. The breakthrough came on a Thursday. James was running his floor buffer in the corridor outside Carter's office, the loud drone of the machine providing the perfect acoustic cover. He'd deliberately loosened a wheel on his cleaning cart earlier, causing it to squeak incessantly. He parked the noisy cart near Carter's slightly ajar door, feigning the need to fix the wheel. Leaning down, out of sight, he was perfectly positioned to listen. The conversation inside was low and conspiratorial. He pressed his ear closer to the gap. Tests continued to show progressive cardiovascular deterioration. Dr. Patterson's voice was a nervous whisper, thin and reedy. The microdoses are accumulating as expected. Her blood pressure is erratic, and there are signs of arterial inflammation. But the official reports... Carter's voice was a gravelly rumble of impatience. Within normal parameters, as we agreed, Patterson assured him. I've coded them as stress-related fluctuations. Her latest blood work, which I drew yesterday, I've logged as perfectly clean. A soft chuckle from Carter. Perfect. You're a magician, Doc. How much longer, would you estimate? There was a pause, the rustle of papers. With the current regimen, I'm prescribing disguised as high-potency, vitamin and mineral supplements, I say. We have another 6 months. Maybe less. The next serious episode will be definitive. A massive coronary or another, more severe, stroke. Either way, it will be tragic, but medically unimpeachable. James felt the blood drain from his face. He had to physically grip the cart to keep his knees from buckling. This was beyond negligence. It was cold-blooded, methodical murder, administered one vitamin at a time. They weren't just letting her die. They were actively, patiently, killing her. Dorothy's lessons had taught him how to save a life, but they had also shown him the darkest corners of medical malfeasance. She had always said that the greatest evil was a healer who harms. A betrayal of the most sacred trust. He needed more. He needed proof. Overhearing a conversation was not enough. The missing piece of the puzzle, the motive, arrived in the form of Marcus Johnson. Marcus was a day-shift HVAC technician, a decade younger than James, with a lean, wiry frame and the hyper-aware eyes of a man who had seen things. An Afghanistan veteran who'd learned advanced electronics in the Signal Corps. He now supported a wife and 3 kids on a patchwork of contract jobs. He and James had a quiet rapport, a shared understanding of being the building's essential, yet overlooked, infrastructure. On a Friday afternoon during the shift change, Marcus pulled James aside in the quiet of the boiler room. Man, you are not gonna believe this, Marcus whispered, his eyes wide. I was up on 25 swapping out the HEPA filters in the executive wing. I'm in the ceiling space right over Carter's office, right? And I hear him on the phone. Thought it was a private call, but he's talking loud. He's talking about Sterling Industries stock, shorting some, buying deep call options on others, all tied to what he called an impending leadership transition. He was boasting. Man. Said he knew something no one else on Wall Street did. The final piece clicked into place with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. It wasn't just a power grab. It was a massive insider trading scheme. If Victoria were to die or be permanently incapacitated, as head of security and a senior member of the Emergency Succession Board, Carter would be in a position of temporary, chaotic power. Armed with that foreknowledge, he could leverage the market to make a fortune, all while appearing to be the stoic leader holding the company together in a time of crisis. Dr. Patterson was his tool, the medical instrument for his financial crime. James looked at Marcus, seeing not just a fellow blue-collar worker, but a potential ally with a very specific and very necessary set of skills. He made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of both their lives. Marcus, James said, his voice low and steady, do you still have any contacts from your time in the service? People who understand evidence, documentation, surveillance? Marcus's easygoing demeanor vanished, replaced by the sharp, appraising gaze of a soldier. He studied James's face, seeing the grim determination there. Depends on what you need. Why? For the next hour, surrounded by the rhythmic thrum of the building's mechanical heart, James laid it all out. Victoria's stroke, his intervention, the warning notice, the conversation between Carter and Patterson, the gradual poisoning disguised as vitamins, and now, the insider trading. He told the story with a quiet, factual precision that left no room for doubt. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression growing harder with every detail. When James finished, he let out a long, slow whistle. Attempted murder, conspiracy, and large-scale securities fraud, he said, his voice a tight knot of anger. This is big league. Proving it, though, that's another animal. Their word against ours. A janitor and an HVAC guy. They'll bury us. Not if we have hard evidence, James countered. Not if we have their own words. The plan they hatched in the bowels of the skyscraper was audacious, dangerous, and brilliantly simple. It was a fusion of James's intimate knowledge of the building's routines and Marcus's military-grade technical expertise. Marcus could use his authorized access to the building's core systems to plant listening devices and microcameras. James would provide the window of opportunity, coordinating the installation for a weekend when security was skeletal and the executive floors were a ghost town. One thing bothers me, Marcus said, as they pored over the building's HVAC blueprints, spread across a workbench. Why didn't they just fire you? You saved the CEO. They should give you a medal. Instead, they slap you with a warning but keep you around. It doesn't track. It's the arrogance, James explained, a realization that had been solidifying for days. Firing the hero janitor right after the incident would draw attention, maybe even from Victoria herself once she recovered. It's better to keep me here. They see me every day. They can watch me. They think I'm just some ignorant old man who got lucky once. They think I'm too simple to understand the game they're playing, and too scared of losing my job to make any more trouble. Their arrogance was their vulnerability. They saw him, but they didn't see him. The following Saturday night was the operation. While James performed a meticulous, hours-long deep cleaning of the 25th floor, a legitimate work order he had filed himself, Marcus moved like a ghost through the ventilation shafts and ceiling panels. He wore a headset, communicating with James in clipped, professional whispers. It was a tense, nerve-wracking for hours. Every distant noise, every hum of a passing elevator sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. But Marcus's work was flawless. He installed audio recorders in Carter's office lamp and Patterson's private consultation room. He placed a pinhole camera with a direct feed to a secure cloud server in the spine of a law book on Carter's shelf. By 3 a.m., they had established a surveillance network that would have made the CIA proud. "We're live," Marcus confirmed through the comms, his voice calm from a nondescript van parked 3 blocks away. "The ghost is in the machine. Now we wait for them to talk." They didn't have to wait long. The following Tuesday, Carter and Patterson held their regular meeting. James and Marcus listened in real time, their hearts pounding. The recorded conversation was more chilling than anything they could have imagined. "She's getting suspicious," Patterson fretted, his voice tinny through the speaker. "She asked me about getting a second opinion." "You shut that down." Carter's voice was a low growl. "Tell her it would interfere with the delicate balance of her current treatment. Tell her anything. We're too close. In fact, we need to accelerate the timetable. I want you to double the dosage in her next refill." "Double it," Patterson squeaked. "Wilson, that's reckless. It could trigger a massive, traceable cardiac event. The autopsy." "There won't be an autopsy," Carter snapped. "You're her trusted doctor. You will sign the death certificate yourself. Cause of death, complications from her previous cerebrovascular accident, exacerbated by executive stress." It's a tragic story the media will eat up. The brilliant, overworked CEO who pushed herself too far. It'll start a national conversation about corporate wellness. It's the perfect smokescreen for our transition. James felt a surge of cold fury. He listened to the recording 3 more times, the monstrous, casual evil of their words, branding themselves into his mind. Dorothy's voice was there again, not as a teacher, but as a juror. "Knowledge without action is complicity, Jemmy. You know what they are. Now you have to do something about it." It was time to act. Carter and Patterson had underestimated the invisible man. They had no idea his mind was filled with 2 decades of neurological wisdom. They had no idea he now had an ally with the skills of a covert operative. And they had no idea that their own words, captured in pristine digital quality, had just signed their death warrants. The ignorant janitor they mocked was about to bring their entire corrupt world crashing down around them. The final phase required a plan that was more than just a data dump to the police. A plan that would give Victoria the agency to face her betrayers and would ensure Carter and Patterson understood, in the most humiliating way possible, exactly who had defeated them. James had acquired more than just recordings. Through one of Marcus's army contacts, a forensic accountant who owed Marcus his life after an IED incident outside Kandahar. They had a complete analysis of Carter's finances. The accountant had, with surgical glee, traced 341 suspicious stock and options trades, all timed perfectly to Victoria's manufactured medical episodes. The evidence was ironclad. The first move was on a Wednesday. During the monthly executive board meeting, Victoria, looking stronger but still relying on the deadly vitamins from Dr. Patterson, presided over the meeting. Carter was at her right hand, a portrait of smug confidence. At precisely 10:15 a.m. James entered the boardroom with his cart, a familiar and therefore invisible presence. As he moved around the table, emptying wastebaskets and wiping down surfaces, he performed a single, deft action. He placed a small, sealed envelope on top of Victoria's stack of documents. She glanced at it, frowning, assuming it was a late addition to the agenda. She opened it. Inside, a single typewritten sentence on a plain white card. The supplements Dr. Patterson prescribed are not vitamins. Have an independent lab test. The contents of the bottle in your purse. A friend, James, watched from the hallway, polishing the same section of glass for 5 full minutes. He saw the subtle shift in her posture. He saw her eyes narrow almost imperceptibly. He saw Carter, deep in his presentation on quarterly security expenditures, notice nothing. And then he saw Victoria's hand discreetly move to her purse, fingers closing around the bottle of pills. The seed of doubt had been planted in fertile ground. Phase 2 was executed. 2 hours later, Dr. Patterson arrived for his weekly checkup with Victoria. He didn't know that the lamp on her credenza now housed a directional microphone, or that Marcus was monitoring the feed from his van. "How are the stress symptoms, Victoria?" Patterson asked, his voice oozing with the false solicitude that made James's skin crawl. "Improving, I think," Victoria replied, her voice cool and measured. "Though I must admit, I'm considering getting a second opinion, Alistair, just to be thorough." Through the audio feed, James heard the doctor's slight intake of breath. "That's entirely unnecessary," Patterson stammered. "Your tests show steady progress." Introducing another physician could confuse the treatment protocols. "And how curious," Victoria said. James could picture her leaning back in her chair, the predator toying with her prey. "Because I received this today." There was the sound of paper unfolding, an anonymous note. "It suggests that my supplements are, in fact, not supplements at all. What would you say, Alistair, if I told you I was sending them to an independent lab for a full chemical analysis this afternoon?" Patterson's panicked, flustered denials were all the confirmation she needed. While he was still trying to talk his way out of the corner she'd backed him into, Phase 3 was already in motion. Marcus, on James's signal, began the coordinated data drop. Encrypted flash drives and files were simultaneously delivered to the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the New York State Medical Board, and a Pulitzer-winning investigative reporter at the Chicago Tribune whom James had chosen for his tenacity and discretion. James had insisted that Victoria be the first to know the full story, that she be armed with the truth before it became a public spectacle. At 5 p.m., James knocked on the door of her office. He was not carrying a cleaning cart. He was carrying a slim, black briefcase. "Miss Sterling," he said as she looked up, surprised. "I believe it's time we talked." For the next 45 minutes, James sat across from her and methodically dismantled her world. He played the audio recordings. He showed her the falsified medical reports next to the real ones Marcus had hacked from Patterson's office server. He walked her through the labyrinth of financial transactions, showing how Carter's trades corresponded with every single one of her dizzy spells and headaches. Victoria listened in absolute, chilling silence. Her expression morphed from disbelief to horror, and finally, settled into a mask of glacial fury. It was the controlled, terrifying anger of a woman who had built an empire by destroying her enemies. They thought I was just a janitor. James finished quietly, someone too ignorant to understand what I was seeing. "You did more than see, James," Victoria said, her voice a dangerous whisper as she stared at the mountain of evidence on her desk. "You understood. You saved my life." Again, the endgame was swift and brutal, orchestrated not by the police, but by Victoria Sterling herself. It was a corporate execution. She called an emergency meeting for Saturday morning, when Wilson Carter swaggered in, expecting to discuss the fallout from her discovery of the pills. He found not just Victoria, but 3 FBI agents, 2 investigators from the SEC, and a stern-faced woman from the State Medical Board. "Wilson," Victoria said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of ice, I'd like you to meet some people who are intensely interested in your stock portfolio and your choice of vitamin supplements. Carter's bravado evaporated, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed panic. Special Agent Martinez began reading him, his Miranda rights as he sputtered denials. Dr. Patterson was arrested at the same time in his lavish Park Avenue clinic, the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists as he desperately tried to wipe his computer's hard drive. The final, public, vindication came on Monday. The Chicago Tribune broke the story on the front page. Janitor hero uncovers conspiracy to murder star CEO. The narrative was irresistible. The working-class black janitor, armed with his deceased wife's medical knowledge, first saving the life of a powerful white female executive and then single-handedly exposing the sophisticated corporate plot against her. It became a national sensation. At a press conference swarming with cameras, Victoria Sterling not only confirmed every detail but announced James's new role, Director of Corporate Safety and Integrity for Sterling Industries, with a starting salary of $200,000 a year and a mandate to rebuild the company's ethics from the ground up. From their respective holding cells, Carter and Patterson watched the broadcast, their faces masks of utter disbelief. They had been outmaneuvered, exposed, and publicly humiliated by the one man in the entire building they had deemed utterly insignificant. 6 months later, James Washington stood in his new office on the 26th floor, one floor above where Victoria's was. The sign on his door was solid brass. He had a panoramic view of the city he had once only cleaned. Marcus Johnson, now his head of electronic security, entered with a report. "Still feels unreal, man," Marcus said, shaking his head as he looked out the window. "The view is different from up here," James agreed, but his gaze fell on the picture on his desk. It was his favorite photo of Dorothy, laughing in the sunshine at a picnic. He had upgraded it from a worn wallet photo to a heavy silver frame. Victoria had just informed him that the first class of the Dorothy Washington Memorial Scholarship for Inner City nursing students had been selected. He thought of Carter, serving the first year of a 25-year sentence, stripped of his wealth and power. He thought of Patterson, his medical license revoked, a pariah in the community he once ruled. Justice had been served, but it was more than that. The knowledge Dorothy had given him, a gift of love, had become a weapon for truth. It had saved a life, then it had saved an empire, and now it was creating a legacy that would echo for generations. He had proven that integrity and intelligence were not products of a person's title or tax bracket. They were products of character, and sometimes the most powerful man in the room is the one no one sees.